there is a document sitting in the French National Archives, approximately 400 pages, bound in faded burgundy, stamped and counterstamped so many times the original ink has almost disappeared beneath the bureaucratic layers. I've read through translations of its core articles more times than I can count, and every single time I find myself stopping at the same clause. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. 11 words that, more than any battle plan or military invention, set the trajectory for the most destructive war in human history. Most people know the outcome of the Second World War. Fewer understand how deliberately, how mechanically, how almost inevitably it was constructed. Not in a bunker in Berlin, not on a battlefield, but in a palace ballroom outside Paris on the 28th of June, 1919. While the ink was still wet on the armistice that had supposedly ended all wars. This is the story I want to tell you tonight. Not just the campaigns and the generals, though we will get to those in exhausting and precise detail. What I want you to understand, what keeps bringing me back to these archives, is the connective tissue between events, the way one diplomatic failure leads, through a chain of smaller failures, to a catastrophe that consumed somewhere between 70 and 85 million lives. The numbers are disputed even now. Historians still argue about the methodology. That uncertainty alone should tell you something about the scale of what happened. Before we begin, I want to ask one thing of you. Stay with this. When the pacing slows and the logistics get dense, that density is intentional. Real history doesn't edit itself for comfort. The Second World War was built from paperwork, from economic tables, from train schedules and fuel calculations and diplomatic cables sent at 3 in the morning. The drama came later. The bureaucracy came first. This is the complete story of the Second World War. Pause. Music swells gently. Title card. If this kind of deep historical research is something you value, the slow, documented, archive-driven kind, then subscribing to this channel is the single most effective thing you can do to keep it going. Every watch, every comment, every subscriber tells the algorithm that careful history matters. Now, let's go back. The war ended on the 11th of November, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning. That is the official record. But I've always thought that framing is a little too clean, a little too ceremonial for what was actually a messy, contested, exhausted conclusion to 4 years of industrialized catastrophe. Germany didn't surrender in the conventional sense. There were no enemy troops on German soil. The German army had simply run out of everything: men, material, domestic political will. The armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne by a German delegation that included no serving military officers, a fact that certain German nationalists would weaponize almost immediately. They called it the Dolchstoß, the stab in the back. The notion that Germany's military had been undefeated in the field, betrayed by politicians and Jews and communists at home. It was false. It was demonstrably, documentably false, but it was useful. Then came Versailles. The peace conference that opened in January 1919 was attended by representatives of more than 30 nations, though the real decisions were made by 3 men: Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Georges Clemenceau of France, and David Lloyd George of Britain. Each arrived with fundamentally different objectives. Wilson wanted his 14 points: national self-determination, a League of Nations, a peace without victors. Clemenceau wanted Germany on its knees. Lloyd George sat somewhere uncomfortable in between, privately worried that crushing Germany would eventually create worse problems, but publicly constrained by a British electorate screaming for reparations. The result was a treaty that satisfied almost nobody and permanently damaged almost everybody. The final document stripped Germany of 13% of its territory and 1/10 of its population. The Rhineland was to be demilitarized and occupied by Allied forces. The German army was capped at 100,000 men, a figure so deliberately humiliating that it's hard to read it as anything other than punitive. And then there was the financial clause. Reparations totaling 269 billion gold marks, a sum so astronomically large that historians still debate whether it was ever meant to be paid in full, or whether it was simply designed as a permanent leash around the German economy. John Maynard Keynes, who attended the conference as a British Treasury advisor, resigned in disgust and published his objections in a book the same year. He called the treaty a Carthaginian peace. That phrase has echoed through every serious analysis of the interwar period since. What I find almost most unbearable to trace, reading through the diplomatic correspondence of the early 1920s, is the absolute predictability of what followed. The Weimar Republic, the democratic government established in Germany in 1919, inherited not just the treaty's terms, but the political fury those terms had generated. Every time the government attempted to comply with a reparations demand, nationalist politicians accused them of treason. Every time they missed a payment, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley. In January 1923, French and Belgian forces occupied the industrial heartland of Germany to force payment in kind, in goods and coal and steel, after Germany defaulted on timber deliveries. The German government responded by calling for passive resistance, which they funded by printing money. By November 1923, a single American dollar was worth approximately 4 billion German marks. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 4 billion. That is not hyperinflation as an economic concept. That is the complete erasure of every middle-class savings account, every pension, every small business that had held its reserves in the national currency. The psychological wound that period inflicted on an entire generation of Germans cannot be overstated, and it cannot be separated from what came next. Into that specific atmosphere of humiliation, economic trauma, and institutional instability walked a very specific kind of political operator. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, had been a fringe group through most of the early 1920s. Adolf Hitler had attempted a coup in Munich in November 1923, the Beer Hall Putsch, which failed comprehensively, resulting in his arrest. He served less than 9 months of a 5-year sentence, during which he dictated the first volume of Mein Kampf. The failed coup and the prison sentence could easily have been the end of the story. For a few years, it looked like it might be. Then, 1929 arrived, and with it, the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression rolled across the Atlantic into an economy that was already fragile. Unemployment in Germany climbed to more than 6 million by 1932. The Nazi Party's share of the vote in the Reichstag went from under 3% in 1928 to over 37% in July 1932. That trajectory, from fringe to plurality in 4 years, is one of the most studied political phenomena in modern history. And it's still not fully understood. What historians do broadly agree on is this: it wasn't just economic desperation that drove voters to the Nazis. It was the specific narrative the party offered, that Germany's suffering was not the result of historical forces or structural failures, but of deliberate betrayal by identifiable enemies. That is an old political template. It works because it transforms complex, diffuse pain into simple, targeted anger. I don't think there's a more important pattern to understand if you want to make sense of what the next decade produced. On the 30th of January, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. The conservative establishment believed they could control him. They were wrong in ways that eventually engulfed the world. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Aggression. There's a tendency, I've noticed, to compress the 1930s into a simple narrative. Hitler got power, started rearming, everyone appeased him, war happened. That compression loses something important, because the decade between 1933 and 1939 was not a smooth escalation. It was a series of calculated tests, some of which were genuinely risky, some of which were almost absurdly easy, and each successful test made the next one bolder. What I find genuinely alarming, reading through the diplomatic records, is how many points there were at which the trajectory could have changed. It didn't, but it could have. The first major violation of Versailles came in March 1936, when German troops reoccupied the Rhineland. This was the demilitarized buffer zone between Germany and France. Its remilitarization was explicitly prohibited by both the Treaty of Versailles and the later Locarno treaties. Hitler's own generals were deeply nervous about this move. German forces numbered fewer than 30,000 men in the initial advance, and they had orders to immediately withdraw if France responded militarily. France did not respond militarily. Britain did not respond militarily. The League of Nations issued statements. German troops stayed. This is the moment that many military historians point to as the hinge, the point at which a firm Allied response might still have been sufficient to force a German retreat, and potentially to undermine Hitler's domestic political standing. That response never came. From there, the escalation follows a grimly logical sequence. In March 1938 came the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, which was formally prohibited by the peace settlement. Austrian Nazi sympathizers assisted from within. German troops crossed the border without resistance. The international response was, again, muted. 6 months later, at the Munich conference in September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, French Premier Édouard Daladier, Italian leader Benito Mussolini, and Hitler agreed to the cession of the Sudetenland, the German-speaking border region of Czechoslovakia, to Germany. Czechoslovakia was not present at the conference where its territorial integrity was being negotiated away. When Chamberlain returned to London and waved his piece of paper declaring "Peace for our time," the crowd that greeted him was genuinely euphoric. The trauma of the First World War was still less than 20 years in the past. The desire for this to not be happening was overwhelming. I understand that impulse completely. I just also know what came next. There is a historiographical debate that I want to flag here, because it matters for how you understand everything that follows. The traditional view, and for a long time, the dominant one, is that appeasement was simply a catastrophic policy error, born of naivety and moral cowardice. The revisionist counter-argument, developed most extensively by historians like A.J.P. Taylor and later refined by others, is that British and French policymakers were making rational calculations given their genuine military unpreparedness, and that Munich bought at least a year of rearmament time. Both arguments have merit. What they share is the premise that by 1938, the situation had already deteriorated past the point where easy solutions existed. That deterioration had begun in 1933, in 1936. In March 1938, each accommodation created the conditions for the next demand. In March 1939, Germany occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia. Not the German-speaking Sudetenland this time, but the Czech heartland, Bohemia, and Moravia, territories that no legitimate self-determination argument could justify annexing. This was the moment British policy visibly snapped. Chamberlain issued a guarantee to Poland the same month. If Germany attacked Poland, Britain and France would go to war. It was a remarkable reversal, and privately, many in the British government knew it was a guarantee they had almost no practical means of honoring in the short term. Poland was hundreds of miles away. The British Expeditionary Force was modest in size. The French army, large as it was organized almost entirely for defensive operations. But the guarantee was issued. It meant that the next German move would have to be met with something other than another piece of paper. That next move was prepared throughout the summer of 1939, and its immediate context was a diplomatic event so startling that even experienced foreign ministry officials in London, Paris, and Washington struggled to believe it was real when the news broke. On the 23rd of August, 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. The two ideological enemies, the two regimes that had spent years defining themselves against each other. A secret protocol divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence between them. Poland was to be partitioned. The Baltic states and Finland were designated Soviet. The world had been watching the wrong diplomacy all summer. Chapter 3. The world breaks open. I want to spend a moment on what the 1st of September, 1939 actually felt like to the people living through it, because I think we lose something when we treat the outbreak of war purely as a political event. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, which was already in the port of Danzig on what was officially described as a courtesy visit, opened fire on Polish fortifications at the Westerplatte garrison at approximately 4:45 in the morning. Simultaneously, 62 German divisions, supported by more than 1,300 aircraft, crossed the Polish border along multiple axes. Army Group North drove south from Pomerania and East Prussia. Army Group South advanced northeast from Silesia and Slovakia. The plan was envelopment, cutting through Polish lines faster than the Polish command could respond and organizing coherent defensive positions, then closing the pockets from behind. Poland's strategic position was, in retrospect, almost impossible. The country's borders were long and largely indefensible, shaped by the post-Versailles settlement rather than any military logic. Polish military planning, documented in what was called Plan Z, had assumed that France would rapidly mobilize and strike westward into Germany, drawing off German forces and giving Polish units room to stabilize their front. That assumption was wrong. French mobilization was slow. The attack into Germany that Poland was counting on, a genuine, sustained offensive into the Saar region, never materialized beyond a brief, tentative advance that halted after a few days, and then withdrew. Poland fought largely alone. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, that Germany employed was not, as popular history sometimes presents it, a completely new invention. The principles of combined arms warfare, the integration of armor, aircraft, and motorized infantry, had been theorized and discussed in military literature throughout the 1920s and 30s. What Germany had done was actually implement those principles at operational scale, with trained units that had absorbed the doctrine at every level. Tanks did not operate as isolated battering rams. They punched holes in the forward defensive line and then drove deep into the rear, targeting headquarters, supply lines, and communication nodes. Air power didn't just attack ground targets. It functioned as a form of flying artillery and, crucially, as a system for preventing the Polish command from sending orders or receiving accurate information about where the German advance actually was. The effect was psychological as much as physical. Units that weren't being directly attacked still found themselves cut off, without communications, without supply, without any clear picture of what was happening. The Polish Air Force was not destroyed on the ground in the opening hours, as some early accounts suggested, a point that several Polish and Western historians have worked to correct. Polish pilots flew and flew hard, but the Luftwaffe maintained air superiority from early in the campaign, and that air superiority translated into a kind of operational freedom for German ground forces that Polish commanders simply could not match. There were moments of fierce and coherent Polish resistance. The defense of the Westerplatte garrison lasted more than a week beyond its expected capitulation, and the Battle of the Bzura River between the 9th and 15th of September was a genuine Polish counterattack that caused real problems for the German advance before being crushed. These were not token gestures. They were the actions of an army fighting in conditions that made coherent defense almost impossible. On the 17th of September, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, pursuant to the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Two foreign armies, simultaneously, from opposite directions. Poland's fate was sealed within days of this second invasion, though isolated garrisons and formations continued to resist for weeks. Warsaw held out until the 27th of September. The last organized Polish resistance surrendered at Koch on the 5th of October. Roughly 20,000 Polish soldiers managed to escape south through Romania and Hungary, eventually making their way to France and Britain to continue fighting. The occupation that followed both halves of partitioned Poland was brutal in ways I won't detail at length here, but which matter enormously for the broader story. Because what happened to Poland under occupation shaped the political and moral stakes of everything that followed. Britain and France declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September, 2 days after the invasion began. The declarations were legally meaningful and morally significant. Militarily, in the immediate term, they changed almost nothing for Poland. That gap between declaration and action is one of the most uncomfortable facts of the opening period of the war, and the people of Poland were aware of it in real time. I find it difficult to read the diplomatic cables and memoirs from those weeks without a particular kind of discomfort. The guarantee had been given. The guarantee had not been honored in any practical sense. That contradiction was not lost on anyone. Chapter 4. The Quiet Before the Storm and the Storm. The period from September 1939 to May 1940 became known, in the press and in popular memory, as the Phony War. The British called it the Boer War. The Germans used the term Sitzkrieg, a play on Blitzkrieg. These are journalistic coinages, and like most journalistic coinages, they capture something real while also distorting it. Because the war was not actually phony. It was simply not yet happening in Western Europe on land, which was the part that Western European people could directly observe. At sea, it was already brutal. On the evening of the 3rd of September, 1939, hours after the British declaration of war, a German U-boat torpedoed the passenger liner SS Athenia in the North Atlantic, killing more than 100 civilians. The Battle of the Atlantic had effectively begun before the ink on the declaration was dry. In October 1939, U-47, commanded by Günther Prien, penetrated the Royal Navy's anchorage at Scapa Flow, considered virtually impregnable, and sank the battleship HMS Royal Oak, killing more than 800 crew members. This was not a phony war to the families of those men. The Royal Navy's confidence in its ability to simply close off German sea trade, as it had in the First World War, was already being tested in ways that the surface headlines didn't fully reflect. On land in Western Europe, the situation was one of studied paralysis. The French army, the largest land force in the Allied coalition, sat behind the Maginot Line, an extraordinary feat of military engineering stretching roughly 300 kilometers along the Franco-German border, featuring fortifications sunk deep into the earth, with underground railways, artillery batteries, barracks, and hospitals designed to allow defenders to hold out almost indefinitely. The British Expeditionary Force, which had begun arriving in France in early September, numbered fewer than 500,000 men in these opening months. Both armies waited. German forces behind their own fortifications, the West Wall, did the same. A French probing advance into the Saar region in September lasted a matter of days before retreating. The RAF, rather than bombing German military targets, spent the early weeks of the war dropping leaflets over German cities, an activity that the crews involved apparently found deeply embarrassing. What was actually happening during these months was not nothing. It was rearmament, planning, argument, and intelligence failure, all simultaneously. The Allies' fundamental strategic plans assumed that Germany would do what Germany had done in 1914, attack through Belgium and northern France, pushing west. Allied forces were therefore positioned and ready to advance into Belgium the moment Germany moved. The Germans, aware of this, were debating their own plans. The original plan, Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, was broadly consistent with Allied expectations. It called for the main weight of the attack to fall through central Belgium. Then, in January 1940, a German courier aircraft was forced to land in Belgium, and the officer on board was carrying documents related to Fall Gelb. The documents may have been destroyed, or they may have been read by Belgian intelligence. Either way, the German High Command decided the plan was potentially compromised. What came next was one of the most consequential revisions of military planning in the entire war. General Erich von Manstein proposed an alternative. Shift the main armored thrust south, through the Ardennes forest. The Ardennes was considered by nearly all professional military analysis on both sides to be unsuitable for large-scale armored operations. The terrain was difficult, the roads were narrow, and getting a large panzer force through it would require a degree of logistical precision that seemed unlikely. That assessment, as it turned out, was wrong. Not catastrophically wrong in theory. The challenges were real, but wrong in the crucial sense that it led Allied planners to treat the Ardennes as a secondary axis, defended by second-line and reserve formations. Manstein's plan, known as Sickelschnitt, the cut of the sickle, counted on exactly that assumption. It was approved by Hitler over the objections of more conventionally minded generals, and it would work spectacularly. In April 1940, while Allied attention was focused on the growing crisis in Scandinavia, where Germany had invaded Denmark and Norway in a swift combined operation that caught the Allies completely off guard, German forces were moving into position along the Belgian, Dutch, and Ardennes frontiers. The Norwegian campaign had its own significance. It triggered a political crisis in Britain that brought Neville Chamberlain down. After a brutal parliamentary debate on the 7th and 8th of May, in which former Prime Minister Leo Amery quoted Cromwell to the government, "You have sat too long here for any good you have been doing. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you." Chamberlain resigned. On the 10th of May 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. On the same day, Germany launched its assault on Western Europe. Chapter 5. 40 days that changed everything. The assault on Western Europe that began on the 10th of May, 1940 is among the most studied military operations of the entire war, and it still generates genuine historiographical controversy. The speed of it, the scale of it, the apparent totality of the French collapse. None of this was considered likely by Allied intelligence in advance, and all of it is now treated as having been almost inevitable in retrospect. Both of those things can't really be true simultaneously. I think what actually happened sits in a more uncomfortable middle ground. The French army was not the broken, demoralized force of popular memory, but it was organized and commanded in ways that made it particularly vulnerable to exactly the kind of attack it received. The opening moves on the 10th of May were devastating in their precision. German paratroopers and glider-borne infantry captured the Belgian fortress of Eben Emmel, considered one of the most powerful fortifications in Western Europe, in a matter of hours. This was not something Allied planners had seriously modeled as a tactical possibility. Simultaneously, German forces poured through the Netherlands and central Belgium, and the Allied command did exactly what the German plan had anticipated. It advanced its best mobile forces, including the British Expeditionary Force, northeast into Belgium to meet what looked like the main German thrust. It was, in military parlance, a feint, a very large, very violent feint that committed the Allies' most capable forces to the wrong direction. Meanwhile, the armored columns of Army Group A were forcing their way through the Ardennes. This was the genuinely audacious part of the operation. Roughly 1,200 tanks, with supporting motorized infantry and artillery, moving through narrow forest roads in a column that stretched, at its peak, back more than 100 kilometers. The logistical risk was enormous. A determined air attack on those forest roads could have created a traffic jam from which recovery would have been nearly impossible. The Allied air forces didn't manage that attack in time. By the 13th of May, lead elements of the German armor had crossed the Meuse River at Sedan, the same town where France had suffered a catastrophic defeat in 1870, and were driving west through open country behind the Allied line. When I look at the maps of those days, and the day-by-day operational maps are genuinely some of the clearest evidence we have of how fast things moved, the thing that strikes me most forcibly is how quickly the French High Command lost what we would now call situational awareness. The speed of the German advance through the Ardennes exceeded even German planners' most optimistic projections. By the 19th of May, 9 days after the offensive began, German armored spearheads had reached the English Channel near Abbeville, cutting the Allied forces in France into two completely separated groups. The British Expeditionary Force, Several French armies and the Belgian army were trapped in a pocket in northern France and Belgium, with their backs to the sea. What happened next is one of those events where the historical record is genuinely contested and genuinely strange. Hitler ordered a halt to the armored advance on the 24th of May, just as German panzer units were within striking distance of Dunkirk, the last major port through which surrounded Allied forces could escape. The reasons for this halt order are disputed. Arguments range from concerns about overextending armored units, to Göring's insistence that the Luftwaffe could finish the job alone, to broader political considerations. Whatever the reason, the halt lasted approximately 3 days, and those 3 days were the margin by which more than 338,000 Allied troops were evacuated across the English Channel. Nearly 700 vessels participated in the evacuation, from destroyers to 18-foot fishing boats. It was called Operation Dynamo. It was, by any measure, a logistical miracle born directly from a military catastrophe. Left behind at Dunkirk were more than 2,000 pieces of artillery, more than 85,000 motor vehicles, and more than 440 British tanks. The men were saved. The equipment was lost. Churchill, in his famous speech to Parliament on the 4th of June, was precise about this. Wars are not won by evacuations. He was right. Dunkirk was not a victory. It was a rescue that preserved the human core of the British Army for a war that now had to be fought from a position of extraordinary vulnerability. France, without the bulk of its best mobile forces, lasted only a few more weeks. The French government requested an armistice on the 17th of June 1940. It was signed in the same railway carriage at Compiègne, where Germany had signed the armistice of 1918. A deliberate, theatrical act of revenge that Hitler personally choreographed. France had fallen in 46 days. Chapter 6. The few and the many after France fell. There was a period, brief but historically significant, when the German leadership genuinely believed Britain might seek terms. Hitler made what he described as a generous peace offer to Britain in July 1940 via a speech to the Reichstag. Churchill's government did not formally respond. Privately, there were cabinet discussions about whether some form of negotiated settlement was worth exploring. Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, raised the possibility. But Churchill shut those discussions down. The policy would be to fight. What that meant in practical terms, in the summer and autumn of 1940, was an air battle over southern England that would determine whether a German invasion was even possible. Operation Sea Lion. The German plan for the invasion of Britain required two things above all else: air superiority over the English Channel and the invasion beaches, and the suppression of the Royal Navy's ability to intervene against the invasion fleet. Without air superiority, the Luftwaffe could not protect the invasion convoys from naval attack. Without naval protection, the convoys would be destroyed. The entire invasion plan therefore rested on the Luftwaffe first defeating RAF Fighter Command. That task was assigned to the Luftwaffe's 3 air fleets, operating from bases in France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Norway, with a combined total of approximately 2,600 aircraft available for operations. The Battle of Britain, which RAF records officially date from the 10th of July to the 31st of October 1940, was fought in phases. The opening phase involved Luftwaffe attacks on British shipping in the English Channel, probing the RAF's response patterns and attempting to draw Fighter Command into attritional combat on German terms. The second phase, beginning in earnest in August, shifted to attacks on RAF airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories, what is now recognized as the strategy most likely to have actually worked because it was targeting the infrastructure that kept Fighter Command operational. By late August and early September, this campaign was producing measurable results. Several key sector stations had been heavily damaged. Fighter Command's pilot losses were exceeding its replacement rate. The radar chain. The chain home system deserves more attention than it usually gets in popular accounts of the battle. Britain had invested heavily in a network of radar stations along the southern and eastern coasts, and these stations gave Fighter Command a level of advance warning about incoming raids that the Luftwaffe consistently underestimated. Rather than maintaining standing patrols, which would have exhausted pilots and aircraft rapidly, the RAF's Air Marshal Hugh Dowding used radar information to vector squadrons to intercept raids after they had crossed the coast, preserving aircraft and pilot endurance. This was not obvious doctrine at the time. It required both technical infrastructure and a command philosophy willing to trust it. The Luftwaffe, for its part, never fully understood how the British were managing to get their fighters into position so reliably. Then, on the 7th of September, 1940, the Luftwaffe shifted its primary targeting away from the airfields and radar stations and toward London. This shift has been debated ever since. The immediate trigger was a British bombing raid on Berlin, which itself was triggered by German aircraft accidentally bombing London, a sequence of escalation that produced a fundamental strategic change on the German side. Whatever the precise cause, the effect was unambiguous. The pressure on Fighter Command's ground infrastructure was relieved at precisely the moment when it had been most dangerous. Squadrons that had been flying from damaged or partially operational bases could be repositioned. Maintenance crews could work without the constant threat of further attack. The RF recovered its operational coherence while the Blitz began, and German losses over London, where concentrated defenses made raids extremely costly, began to climb. The final statistical ledger of the Battle of Britain is worth reciting carefully, because the numbers have been revised and re-revised over the decades. The RAF lost approximately 1,023 aircraft. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 1,887. 544 RAF Fighter Command pilots and crew were killed. More than 2,500 Luftwaffe aircrew were killed, with many more captured. Churchill's "never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few" was spoken on the 20th of August, 1940, before the battle had even reached its most intense phase. The few he was describing weren't all British. The pilots who flew for Fighter Command that summer included Poles, Czechs, Canadians, New Zealanders, Australians, South Africans, and Americans who had crossed the Atlantic before their country was officially at war. That international dimension of the battle is often compressed in national British memory, and I think it matters. By October 1940, Hitler had indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion. Britain had not been defeated. The German air campaign shifted entirely to night bombing. The Blitz, which killed more than 40,000 British civilians over the following months, but which failed to break either industrial production or public morale in the ways German planners had anticipated. The invasion of Britain would never be attempted. The war, which Germany might plausibly have hoped to conclude by the end of 1940, would now continue, with Britain as an unsinkable base off the coast of Europe, and with an American president increasingly committed to ensuring Britain's survival, and with a German leadership that would, within a year, make the single greatest strategic error of the entire conflict. But that comes later. What the summer of 1940 had established was something more important than a single battle's outcome. It had established that Germany could be resisted, that the momentum of the previous year's campaigns was not unstoppable. That was not a military fact exactly. It was a psychological one. For Britain, for occupied Europe, and perhaps most importantly, for the men in Washington who were watching very carefully and deciding what to do next. Chapter 7. The largest gamble in military history. Operation Barbarossa. There is a moment I keep returning to when I think about the German invasion of the Soviet Union. It isn't the crossing of the border itself, though that was extraordinary in its scale. It's a conversation recorded in the memoirs of General Franz Halder, the German Army Chief of Staff, who noted sometime in the summer of 1941 that when he spread out his maps and tried to account for all the Soviet military formations that had been identified, destroyed, and captured. And then new formations kept appearing on the Eastern Front anyway. He began to suspect that something in the foundational German intelligence assessment of Soviet strength had been catastrophically wrong. He wrote something to the effect that when you knock out a dozen divisions, another dozen appear. And you have to ask whether your original estimate of the enemy's capacity was built on a false picture. That note in Halder's diary is, to me, more revealing about why Germany ultimately lost the Eastern Front than any single battle description. The decision to invade the Soviet Union, encoded in Führer Directive No. 21, Operation Barbarossa, was signed on the 18th of December, 1940. The premise was straightforward in outline and delusional in its assumptions. Germany would strike the Soviet Union with 3 army groups simultaneously. Army Group North, driving toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, aimed at Moscow via Smolensk and Minsk. And Army Group South, pushing into Ukraine toward Kiev and the Donbas industrial region. The campaign was projected to be finished in 8 to 10 weeks, before the Russian winter. The entire Eastern Soviet Union, the logic went, was a rotten structure that would collapse once the outer shell was struck hard enough. Hitler reportedly told his generals that we only have to kick in the door and the whole rotten edifice will come crashing down. Every part of that metaphor was wrong. The force assembled for Barbarossa was genuinely staggering in its dimensions. On the 22nd of June, 1941, the day the invasion began, Germany and its Axis allies committed approximately 3,300,000 troops along a front that stretched more than 2,900 kilometers from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. They were supported by roughly 3,300 tanks and more than 2,700 aircraft. These were numbers without precedent in the history of land warfare to that point. And in the opening weeks, the results seemed to confirm the optimistic projections. Soviet formations were encircled and destroyed in enormous quantities. The battles of Bialystok and Minsk in late June and early July resulted in the encirclement of more than 300,000 Soviet troops. The Battle of Kiev in September produced an even larger encirclement. Approximately 600,000 Soviet soldiers captured or killed in a single operation. These were not close-fought, ambiguous engagements. They were operationally decisive victories of a kind that no army had achieved anywhere at any point in the war. What the numbers concealed was a set of structural problems that were accumulating beneath the surface of German success. German logistics, which had performed well enough in the relatively compact campaigns in Western Europe, were reaching their limits on the vast distances of the Soviet Union. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers through a road network that was, in large parts of the Soviet interior, essentially non-existent by Western European standards. German trucks were wearing out faster than they could be replaced. The Wehrmacht's transportation plan had assumed capturing significant quantities of Soviet rolling stock to supplement German railway capacity. But Soviet engineers destroyed or evacuated an enormous proportion of their locomotives and rolling stock ahead of the German advance. Fuel was a constant constraint. In several of the major encirclements, panzer units had to pause and wait for resupply before they could close the pockets fully, and during those pauses, some Soviet units managed to break out. The precision of the German operational plan was brilliant. The logistical foundation beneath it was fragile in ways that became more apparent with every 100 kilometers of advance. There is a debate among historians, genuinely unresolved, with serious scholars on both sides, about whether Germany could have won the campaign in 1941 if certain key decisions had been made differently. The most commonly cited argument is that Hitler's insistence on diverting Army Group Center's armored strength southward in August and early September to assist in the Kiev encirclement cost Germany the window of opportunity to reach Moscow before winter. The counter-argument is that no single city's capture, even Moscow, would have forced Soviet capitulation, and that the Germans would have faced the same supply and winter problems outside Moscow as they eventually faced at the gates of it. I find myself persuaded by the second argument more than the first, but I hold that view loosely because the counterfactual evidence is necessarily incomplete. What we do know is that the assaults on Moscow, Operation Typhoon, began on the 2nd of October, 1941, by which point German logistics were already degraded. German armored strength had been significantly depleted through weeks of continuous operations, and Soviet resistance had stiffened considerably compared to the catastrophically disorganized formations of June. On the 5th and 6th of December 1941, the Soviet Western Front launched a major counteroffensive west of Moscow, driving German forces back from positions some of them had reached, within roughly 15 kilometers of the Soviet capital. German soldiers who had been equipped for a summer campaign, because it was supposed to be over by autumn, were fighting in temperatures that dropped to below -30 degrees Celsius in some sectors. Equipment froze, lubricants congealed, rifles jammed. The German army was not destroyed by the Soviet winter counteroffensive, but it was seriously damaged and, perhaps more importantly, permanently disabused of the notion that the campaign was proceeding according to plan. Hitler's response to the crisis was to dismiss a large number of senior generals, including Brauchitsch, Bock, Rundstedt, and Guderian, and to personally assume direct command of the army. He would retain that direct command for the rest of the war, with consequences for German strategic decision-making that became increasingly apparent as the conflict continued. The greatest gamble in military history had not paid off on schedule, and Germany was now in a war of attrition on the Eastern Front with a nation whose reserves of men and industrial capacity it had profoundly underestimated. Chapter 8. The War Behind the War, Occupation, Resistance, and the Holocaust. I want to be careful here, and I want to be honest about why. The events I'm about to describe are not, strictly speaking, military history in the conventional sense. There are no campaign maps or operational orders that explain them adequately. They were not the product of battlefield necessity or the fog of war. They were organized, bureaucratized, and carried out as deliberate state policy. And understanding them is not optional if you want to understand what the Second World War actually was, rather than just what it looked like from the perspective of armies moving across maps. The Nazi regime's persecution of Jewish people had been official policy from the moment Hitler took power in January 1933. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped German Jews of citizenship and prohibited marriage or sexual relations between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. By 1939, emigration, forced, economically devastating emigration, had been the primary mechanism of persecution. More than 270,000 German Jews had left Germany by the outbreak of the war. Then the invasion of Poland brought approximately 2 million Polish Jews under German control overnight, and the scale of the problem, as Nazi administrators framed it, changed entirely. Emigration was no longer a workable mechanism. What followed was a sequence of escalating measures, ghettoization, forced labor, mass shootings, that culminated in a decision, the precise timing and authorization of which historians still debate, to murder every Jewish person under German control across occupied Europe. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that followed German armies into the Soviet Union beginning in June 1941, murdered approximately 1.5 million Jewish people in the occupied Soviet territories in the second half of 1941 alone, primarily through mass shootings at sites like Babi Yar near Kiev, where more than 33,000 people were killed over 2 days in late September 1941. These shootings were documented in German operational reports, and copies of those reports survived the war. I find those documents almost unbearable to read, not because of graphic description, but because of their bureaucratic flatness, their tone of administrative routine, their careful noting of numbers and locations as though this were any other logistical operation. The flatness is the horror. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942, attended by senior SS and government officials, coordinated the bureaucratic implementation of what the Nazis called the final solution to the Jewish question, the systematic murder of all Jews in German-controlled Europe. Extermination camps were constructed in occupied Poland: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek. These were not concentration camps in the sense of places of imprisonment and forced labor, though some performed those functions as well. They were facilities designed specifically and primarily for killing at industrial scale. By the end of the war, approximately 6 million Jewish people had been murdered, roughly two-thirds of the Jewish population of pre-war Europe. This is not a figure around which there is serious historical debate. It is as firmly established as any statistical fact in modern history. The broader German occupation policy across Europe produced suffering that extended far beyond the Jewish population, though no other group was targeted for total extermination in the way that Jewish people were. Soviet prisoners of war died in German captivity at a rate that constitutes one of the largest mass deaths of the war. Out of approximately 5.7 million Soviet prisoners taken by Germany, more than 3 million died of starvation, exposure, and deliberate neglect. Polish civilians were subjected to systematic repression. The educated and professional classes had been targeted for killing from the opening weeks of the occupation, in an operation designed to eliminate Polish national leadership. In occupied Western Europe, the character of occupation varied significantly. France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Norway all experienced occupation differently, depending partly on Nazi racial ideology and partly on the degree of local collaboration and resistance. Resistance movements existed across occupied Europe, and their effectiveness varied enormously. The French resistance, the Polish Home Army, the Yugoslav partisans under Josip Broz Tito. These were not equivalent organizations. The Yugoslav partisans eventually fielded a force of hundreds of thousands and tied down significant Axis military resources. The Polish Home Army conducted extensive sabotage and intelligence operations, and its courier networks provided the Allied governments in London with some of the earliest and most detailed information about what was happening in the extermination camps, information that the governments received and then struggled to act upon, or chose not to publicize for reasons that continue to generate profound moral controversy among historians. The French resistance, immortalized in post-war national memory, was smaller and less militarily significant during the occupation than that memory suggests, a fact that French historians have been more willing to address in the decades since de Gaulle's unifying narrative has loosened its grip. None of this diminishes the courage of the individuals involved. It is simply an honest assessment of what they were able to achieve against an occupying power that held all the coercive cards. Chapter 9. The Pacific ignites. Pearl Harbor and the war becomes global. For most of 1941, the war in Asia had been running on a track that felt, to Western observers, somewhat separate from the European conflict. Japan had been at war with China since 1937. A brutal, enormous conflict that had already killed millions and had drawn in every major Japanese military resource without producing the decisive victory that Tokyo's strategic planners had promised. Japan occupied large portions of eastern China, the major coastal cities, and significant inland territory. But the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek had retreated to Chongqing and refused to capitulate. The war in China was a drain. Japan's military and political leadership spent most of 1940 debating how to resolve that drain, whether by negotiating a settlement, by expanding southward to seize the resources of Southeast Asia, or by some combination of both. The United States, watching Japanese expansion with increasing concern, had been applying economic pressure. In July 1941, following Japan's occupation of southern French Indochina, the Roosevelt administration froze Japanese assets in the United States and imposed an oil embargo. Japan imported approximately 80% of its oil from the United States. The embargo was not, as the Americans almost certainly understood, a measure Japan could simply absorb. What followed was a strategic calculation of extraordinary audacity and, in the long run, catastrophic miscalculation. Japan's leadership concluded that war with the United States was probably inevitable given the embargo, that waiting would only allow American military strength to grow, and that a sudden, overwhelming strike against American naval power in the Pacific, combined with simultaneous seizures of the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, the Philippines, and Burma, would present the United States with a fait accompli so enormous that Washington would prefer a negotiated settlement to the cost of reversing it. This was not an insane calculation, given what the strategic picture looked like in late 1941. Germany appeared to be winning in Russia. Britain was still on the defensive. The American public had shown limited appetite for foreign wars. The gamble rested on a particular reading of American political will. It was wrong. On the 7th of December, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. In the words Franklin Roosevelt used to Congress the following morning, a force of approximately 350 Japanese aircraft launched from 6 aircraft carriers attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in 2 waves. The attack sank or seriously damaged 8 American battleships, destroyed approximately 180 aircraft, and killed 2,403 American military personnel and 68 civilians. It was a tactically precise, operationally bold operation that achieved almost everything it set out to achieve in material terms. It failed, crucially, to catch the American aircraft carriers, which were at sea that morning. It failed to destroy the Pearl Harbor fuel depot, the destruction of which might have paralyzed American Pacific operations for considerably longer. And it succeeded, beyond any Japanese planner's expectation, in unifying American public opinion behind the war in a way that no political argument had managed to achieve in the previous 2 years. Germany declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor, on the 11th of December. This declaration, voluntary, unrequired by the terms of the Tripartite Pact, which only obligated Germany to assist Japan if Japan were attacked, not if Japan attacked someone else, has puzzled historians ever since. Hitler appears to have believed that Germany and Japan together were too powerful a combination for the United States to defeat, and that delaying an inevitable confrontation was strategically inferior to controlling when it began. He also appears to have fundamentally misread American industrial and military potential. Whatever the reasoning, the declaration transformed the strategic geometry of the war entirely. Britain, which had been fighting alone in Europe since the fall of France, now had as its ally a nation with a gross domestic product larger than Germany, Japan, Italy, and the entire Axis combined. The outcome of the war was not determined on the 7th or the 11th of December 1941. There were 3.5 years of fighting still to come, much of it enormously costly. But the fundamental question of whether the Allies had the industrial and manpower resources to eventually win was, from that point forward, answered. In the weeks and months following Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces executed an extraordinary sequence of rapid conquests across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. British Malaya fell in 70 days, the fall culminating in the surrender of Singapore on the 15th of February 1942, the single largest surrender of British forces in history, with approximately 85,000 soldiers captured. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The Philippines fell. Burma fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. In just 6 months, Japan had seized a resource empire stretching from Manchuria to the borders of India, encompassing the oil fields of Borneo and Sumatra that had been the strategic objective all along. The Empire of the Rising Sun, at its maximum extent in mid-1942, covered a larger area than any empire in history to that point, holding it against an adversary whose industrial capacity was now fully committed to war would prove to be an entirely different problem from seizing it. The turning point in the Pacific, the moment when Japanese naval expansion hit its limit, came at the Battle of Midway between the 4th and 7th of June, 1942. American codebreakers had broken sufficient Japanese naval cipher traffic to know that a major Japanese operation was aimed at Midway Atoll, and Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned his 3 available carriers, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, in ambush. In a battle decided largely by carrier-based aircraft rather than surface ships, the United States sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Japan lost not just 4 ships, but approximately 248 aircraft, and, crucially, many of its most experienced naval aviators, trained specialists that Japan's training pipeline could not quickly replace. The United States lost Yorktown and approximately 147 aircraft. Midway did not end the Pacific War. It ended Japan's strategic initiative. Chapter 10. The Desert, the Turning, and the Weight of Supply. While the Eastern Front was consuming men and material in quantities that are still difficult to comprehend, a separate and, in some ways, more accessible campaign was being fought across the vast distances of North Africa. I say more accessible, not because it was simpler. North African logistics were brutal, and the fighting was often ferocious, but because the Desert Campaign has a certain clarity to it. Fewer civilians, fewer complicating political factors. 2 sets of armies, facing each other across a landscape that offered neither side cover or concealment, where the war of movement and supply was almost nakedly visible in the operational record. It was also the campaign that produced, on both sides, some of the most thoughtful memoirs and after-action analyses of the entire war, partly because the officers involved had time to reflect, and partly because the desert, in some strange way, seemed to encourage a certain directness of observation. The North African campaign had begun in September 1940, when Italian forces in Libya advanced into Egypt against a significantly smaller British garrison. The subsequent British counter-offensive, Operation Compass, launched in December 1940, was one of the more spectacular successes of the early war period. Roughly 36,000 British and Commonwealth troops under Generals O'Connor and Wavell routed an Italian force of more than 200,000, capturing roughly 130,000 prisoners and advancing roughly 800 kilometers in 2 months. The victory was so complete that it effectively destroyed Italy's military capacity in North Africa as an independent force. It also triggered the arrival, in February 1941, of a German expeditionary force, the Deutsches Afrikakorps, under a general who would become one of the most studied commanders of the entire war, Erwin Rommel. Rommel's reputation in the North African campaign is one of those historiographical subjects where I have to be careful to separate what the evidence shows from what the mythology has constructed. The mythology, which grew substantially in both British and German post-war writing, presents him as a near-invincible desert genius, tactically brilliant beyond his contemporaries, the desert fox of popular imagination. The evidence is more complex. Rommel was genuinely gifted at reading ground and at improvised, fast-moving operations. He led from the front in ways that gave him excellent situational awareness, but sometimes left his headquarters without adequate command and control. He was also, on multiple occasions, operationally reckless in ways that his logistical situation couldn't support, advancing further than his supply lines could follow, gambling on capturing Allied fuel depots to refuel his own vehicles, and frequently outrunning any reasonable logistical sustainability. The campaign swung back and forth across Libya and Egypt, partly because both sides had supply problems. But Rommel's supply problems were generally worse and more structurally intractable, because the Axis held no port east of Tripoli capable of handling significant tonnage. The campaign's decisive phase came in the autumn of 1942 at El Alamein, a position roughly 100 kilometers west of Alexandria, where the southern flank of the front was anchored on the impassable Qattara Depression. making the kind of sweeping flanking maneuvers that had characterized earlier desert fighting impossible. The First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942 stopped a German advance that had reached its logistical limit. The Second Battle, beginning on the 23rd of October 1942, was fought under conditions that General Bernard Montgomery had carefully constructed over the preceding months. Stockpiled ammunition, prepared positions, trained replacements for both men and equipment, and a level of logistical preparation that Rommel's force simply could not match. By November, Axis forces were in retreat westward. Montgomery's critics have argued that the pursuit after El Alamein was too cautious, allowing more Axis forces to escape than a more aggressive pursuit might have caught. Montgomery's defenders point out that he was operating at the end of supply lines nearly 2,000 kilometers long, and that the risk of a failed pursuit in those conditions outweighed the potential gains. Both arguments have merit. Almost simultaneously with El Alamein, on the 8th of November 1942, American and British forces landed in French North Africa, Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch. This was the first major American land offensive in the European theater, and its performance was mixed. At the Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German forces under Rommel struck American units that were still in the process of learning how to fight at formation level, and the results were a significant and embarrassing reversal. American units broke and retreated in disorder, and the encounter exposed serious problems with American tactical training, unit cohesion, and the integration of armor and infantry. Kasserine was not a catastrophe in strategic terms, but it was a brutal education, and the United States Army learned from it at a speed that is genuinely impressive in retrospect. The North African campaign ended on the 13th of May, 1943, with the surrender of more than 250,000 Axis troops in Tunisia, a figure comparable in scale to the disaster that had befallen Germany at Stalingrad 5 months earlier. The North African campaign matters beyond its immediate military results for several reasons. It established the Anglo-American alliance as a functional military partnership. Difficult, sometimes contentious, shaped by genuine disagreements between commanders, but ultimately capable of coordinated operations at scale. It provided the American Army with a combat laboratory in which to identify and correct its doctrinal and leadership problems before attempting larger operations in Europe, and it set the stage for the invasion of Sicily and Italy, a campaign whose strategic rationale and whose costs generated one of the most bitter arguments of the entire Allied strategic partnership. Chapter 11. Stalingrad. Where the wind changed. There are battles that decide campaigns, and there are battles that decide wars. Stalingrad was the second kind. I want to be precise about this, because there is a tendency in popular history to treat it as the obvious turning point of the Eastern Front in retrospect, and to imply that contemporaries must have known this as it was happening. They didn't. The scale of the disaster was not immediately visible in its early phases. And even at the end, German propaganda managed the news from the Volga with sufficient care that the full scope of what had happened took weeks to penetrate German public consciousness. But when it did penetrate, when the reality became undeniable, something shifted in how Germans related to the regime, to the war, and to the future. That shift is measurable in the security service reports that were quietly compiled and are now available to historians. The confidence curve broke at Stalingrad, and it never fully recovered. The German summer offensive of 1942, Case Blue, was not originally centered on Stalingrad in the way it became in execution and memory. The primary strategic objective was the Caucasus oil fields, whose capture would simultaneously deny Soviet industry a crucial fuel source and provide Germany with the petroleum resources its war economy increasingly needed. Stalingrad, a major industrial city on the Volga, was initially a secondary objective. Its capture would secure the northern flank of the drive into the Caucasus. But the city's name, bearing Stalin's name, something Hitler had not failed to notice, gradually elevated it in the Führer's mind from a flank-securing operation to a prestige objective that had to be captured regardless of cost. As German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, drove deeper into the city through the late summer of 1942, the fighting shifted from the open-ground mobile warfare, in which German forces excelled, into something entirely different. The battle inside Stalingrad from September through November 1942 became what Soviet soldiers called Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats. Street fighting, building by building, floor by floor, sometimes room by room in ruined factories and apartment blocks along the Volga bank. These conditions systematically negated the operational advantages that had made German forces so formidable in open country. Air support was difficult to coordinate without killing your own troops. Armor was of limited use in rubble. Radio communications were unreliable in dense urban terrain. The German army had not trained specifically for this kind of fighting, and it showed. Soviet commander Vasily Chuikov, commanding the 62nd Army inside the city, developed tactics specifically designed to keep German and Soviet troops in such close proximity that German air and artillery support couldn't be used effectively, what he called hugging the Germans. The ruins of the Barricade gun factory and the Red October steel plant became tactical objectives in themselves, contested for weeks at a time. What Chuikov's men in Stalingrad probably didn't know, certainly not its full dimensions, was that the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, under the direction of Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, was quietly preparing an operation of strategic ambition that far exceeded anything Germany believed the Soviet military was capable of organizing in the autumn of 1942. Operation Uranus, launched on the 19th of November 1942, struck not at the German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad, but at the armies flanking it on either side. The Romanian Third Army to the north and the Romanian Fourth Army to the south. Romanian forces were not equipped or trained to resist a major armored breakthrough. Within 4 days, Soviet armored spearheads from the north and south had linked up at Kalach on the Don, roughly 80 kilometers west of Stalingrad. German Sixth Army, approximately 300,000 men, plus attached Romanian, Croatian, and other Axis units, was encircled. Hitler refused to allow a breakout. The decision was argued over with enormous bitterness at the time and has been debated ever since. The case for staying was largely driven by Göring's promise that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled force by air, a promise that was logistically impossible from almost the first calculation, though it took weeks for this impossibility to become operationally undeniable. A relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, led by Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, came within roughly 50 kilometers of the encirclement in December before being halted by Soviet counter-pressure and its own supply limitations. The airlift delivered a fraction of the daily tonnage the encircled force required. By January 1943, men inside the Kessel, the cauldron, were starving. On the 2nd of February, 1943, the last German forces inside Stalingrad surrendered. Paulus, whom Hitler had promoted to field marshal the day before, since no German field marshal had ever surrendered, the implicit expectation was that Paulus would kill himself, chose surrender. Approximately 91,000 men, many of them severely ill or frostbitten, went into Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 of them would eventually return to Germany. The aftermath of Stalingrad was felt at every level of German society and military planning. Strategically, Germany would launch one more major offensive on the Eastern Front. Operation Citadel, the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, which would fail after a week of fighting and permanently transfer strategic initiative on the Eastern Front to the Soviet Union. The Soviet industrial mobilization, aided significantly by American Lend-Lease equipment, including hundreds of thousands of trucks that freed Soviet forces from their own chronic transport limitations, was producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery at rates that German intelligence had consistently underestimated. The Red Army of 1943 was not the organization that had nearly disintegrated in the summer of 1941. It had learned, at devastating cost, how to fight the kind of war it was fighting. The learning curve had been paid for in human lives on a scale that is difficult to frame. Soviet military and civilian losses in the war against Germany are estimated at somewhere between 25 and 27 million. That number sits at the center of every serious analysis of the Eastern Front, and it should. Chapter 12. The Alliance, the Argument, and the Weight of Decision. By the time 1943 opened, with Germany's Sixth Army surrendering at Stalingrad and Axis forces beginning their retreat in North Africa, the question was no longer whether the Allies would win the war. The question, the genuinely difficult, politically charged, strategically complex question, was how and at what cost and in what sequence. And that question produced some of the most consequential and contentious arguments of the entire conflict, conducted across conference tables in Casablanca, Washington, Quebec, Tehran, and elsewhere, between men who agreed on the fundamental objective, but disagreed, sometimes sharply, about almost everything else. The alliance between Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union was a coalition of necessity, not of ideology or affection, and the fracture lines within it were visible from almost the beginning. The Casablanca Conference of January 1943, held in French Morocco just weeks after the Allied landings, produced one of the most famous and most debated decisions of the entire war: the announcement of a policy of unconditional surrender. Roosevelt announced it publicly, somewhat to Churchill's surprise. The British had known it was being discussed, but the public proclamation was apparently more categorical than Churchill had expected. The policy has been argued about by historians ever since. Critics contend that unconditional surrender removed any incentive for German moderates to overthrow Hitler, since Germany would be destroyed either way, and thus prolonged the war. Defenders argue that any hint of negotiated terms would have caused deep suspicion in Moscow. Stalin had signed one non-aggression pact with Hitler already, and Soviet leaders were acutely sensitive to any sign that the Western Allies might reach a separate accommodation, and that the lessons of 1918, when a negotiated armistice had fed the stab-in-the-back myth, demanded a total and unambiguous military conclusion. Both arguments are serious. I hold them in tension rather than resolving them. The deeper strategic argument of 1943 was over where to strike. The American military leadership, General George Marshall above all, pushed consistently for a cross-channel invasion of northwest France at the earliest opportunity. This was the direct route to Germany, the shortest path to bringing American industrial and manpower superiority to bear in the decisive theater. The British position, shaped by Churchill and by Chief of the Imperial General Staff Alan Brooke, was more cautious. The Allied forces weren't ready for a cross-channel operation in 1943. The amphibious capacity wasn't there, and a failed invasion would be catastrophic. The Mediterranean offered opportunities: Sicily, then Italy, that could knock Italy out of the war, draw German divisions away from both the Eastern Front and northern France, and continue the pressure without risking a premature and potentially disastrous assault on the Atlantic Wall. The Americans suspected, not entirely without justification, that the British caution was partly shaped by Churchill's horror at the prospect of another Western Front bloodbath like 1914 to 1918, that the ghosts of Passchendaele and the Somme were influencing strategy in ways that weren't being stated explicitly. The decision made was the British one. Sicily in the summer of 1943, then Italy. Operation Husky, launched on the 9th of July, 1943, was the largest amphibious operation conducted to that point in the war, landing more than 160,000 troops on the Sicilian coastline in the opening phase. The island was captured in 38 days. The political consequence was swift. On the 25th of July, the Italian fascist Grand Council voted to remove Mussolini from power, and King Victor Emmanuel III had him arrested. Italy was in the process of changing sides. This should have been an enormous Allied opportunity. In practice, the Italian campaign became something considerably more complicated and considerably more costly than its architects had projected. The Germans moved swiftly, occupying central and northern Italy, disarming Italian forces, and establishing a series of defensive lines across the peninsula's mountainous spine that would prove extraordinarily difficult and costly to break. The Allied advance up the Italian boot, which was supposed to draw German forces away from other theaters, ended up consuming Allied resources at a rate that frustrated American planners. Throughout 1944, the Tehran Conference of late November and early December 1943 brought Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin together for the first time in the same room. It was a meeting at which the balance of influence within the Allied coalition became unmistakably clear. Stalin pressed hard for a commitment to the cross-channel invasion, Operation Overlord, in the spring of 1944. He had been pressing for a second front since 1941, and Soviet losses in the meantime had been catastrophic. Roosevelt committed to Overlord. Churchill, facing a united front from his two major allies, agreed. The date was set. The planning began in earnest. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was named Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in December 1943, a choice that reflected the American dominance of the coalition as much as any purely military calculation. The cross-channel invasion that the British had been cautious about, that the Americans had pushed for consistently, that the Soviet Union had demanded at every meeting since the war's early months, would happen in 1944, specifically in the summer, specifically on the beaches of Normandy. Everything the Allies had done since December 1941 was preparation for that morning. What I find genuinely moving, reading the planning documents for Overlord, and I recognize that moving is an unusual word to apply to operational logistics, is the weight of awareness that the planners carried. They knew that a failed invasion would not simply be a military setback. It would be a political catastrophe. For the alliance, for the Western Allies' ability to influence the post-war settlement, and for the men who would be sent to try again, if anyone were sent at all. The planning was meticulous in ways that went far beyond anything the early war period had managed. The logistical tale for the invasion, the prefabricated harbors, the underwater fuel pipelines, the deception operations designed to convince Germany the landing would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, represented the full application of 2.5 years of learning how to conduct modern industrial warfare. It also represented something harder to quantify: the decision, made at the highest levels of the Allied coalition, to accept that thousands of young men would die on a particular stretch of French coastline, and that accepting this was necessary and correct. That decision does not become easier to sit with over time. Chapter 13. The Longest Day. Normandy and the Liberation of Western Europe. There is a briefing document, prepared by the Allied Naval Command in the spring of 1944, that runs to several hundred pages and concerns nothing but the tidal conditions, water depths, sand composition, and beach gradient of 5 stretches of coastline on the Normandy coast of northern France. I've read large portions of it in translation. It is, on its surface, one of the driest pieces of military bureaucracy imaginable. But when you understand what that document was for, when you understand that the measurements in it would determine where young men from Ohio, Yorkshire, Ontario, and New Zealand would set foot on a hostile shore at first light on a specific morning, it becomes something else entirely. The weight of that planning, the industrial seriousness of it, is almost crushing to contemplate. The men who prepared it knew exactly what would happen to many of the men who would land on the beaches it described. Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of Nazi-occupied France, was launched in the early hours of the 6th of June, 1944. In the hours before dawn, more than 13,000 American and British paratroopers were dropped behind the German lines on either flank of the intended landing beaches. The American 82nd and and 1st Airborne Divisions on the western flank, the British 6th Airborne Division in the east. The drops were scattered by wind, cloud, and navigation errors. Units landed miles from their intended drop zones and spent the critical pre-dawn hours trying to find each other in the dark. The chaos was real, and it caused genuine problems with several of the planned objectives. But it also had an unintended consequence. The distribution of paratroopers across a wide area convinced German local commanders that they were facing a larger and more complex operation than the initial reports suggested, and it delayed coherent German responses during the critical early hours. Things going wrong in this case accidentally helped. The naval bombardment that preceded the landings was enormous in its dimensions. More than 6,000 vessels of all types, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, landing craft, minesweepers, supply ships, assembled in the English Channel in what was, at that moment, the largest naval armada in history. Allied air forces flew more than 14,000 sorties on the 6th of June alone. The firepower available to the Allied forces was, in quantitative terms, overwhelming. What it couldn't do was guarantee survival to the infantrymen who had to wade ashore across open beach in the face of prepared German defensive positions. At Omaha Beach, where American forces of the 1st Infantry Division and the 29th Infantry Division landed against the strongest German defensive positions, this reality was at its most brutal. The specialized armored vehicles that were supposed to lead the assault and suppress defensive fire largely never made it to shore. Most of the amphibious tanks launched too far from the beach, foundered in the heavy seas. Infantry companies that landed on certain sectors of Omaha suffered casualties approaching 50% in the first minutes. Men who had practiced this landing dozens of times in training found the beach entirely unlike anything they had rehearsed. Omaha held. It held through individual acts of leadership at the lowest levels. Sergeants and lieutenants who got men off the beach and up the bluffs because the alternative was to die on the sand. By evening of the 6th of June, all 5 beaches had been secured, at a cost that Allied planners had projected might be catastrophically higher. Total Allied casualties on D-Day, killed, wounded, missing, and captured, are estimated at between 10,000 and 12,000, a terrible figure and simultaneously a fraction of what the most pessimistic pre-invasion planning had modeled. The German response to the invasion was fatally hampered by 2 factors. First, the Allied deception operation, Operation Fortitude, had convinced much of the German high command that the Normandy landing was a feint and that the real invasion would come at Pas de Calais, where the channel was narrowest. German armored reserves that might have been thrown at the beaches in the critical first 24 hours were held back, waiting for an attack that never came. Second, the panzer reserves that could move were under Hitler's personal control, and Hitler slept through the first hours of the invasion and wouldn't release the reserves until it was too late for them to reach the beaches before nightfall. The campaign in Normandy that followed the landings was not the rapid breakout that some Allied planners had hoped for. The bocage country of inland Normandy, dense hedgerow terrain that had been farmed for centuries and created natural defensive compartments every few hundred meters, proved to be ideally suited to defensive warfare. German forces, though they couldn't ultimately hold, made the Allied advance pay an extremely high price for every piece of ground. The fighting in Normandy between June and early August was grinding, attritional, and costly in ways that frustrated Allied commanders and occasionally alarmed planners looking at the casualty rates. The British and Canadian forces around Caen bore particularly heavy fighting. Caen, which had been optimistically marked on planning maps as a D-Day objective, wasn't fully in Allied hands until mid-July, over a month late. This slowdown, while costly, did serve a strategic purpose. It drew the bulk of German armored strength toward the British and Canadian sector. And when the American breakout finally came at the western end of the lodgment, in Operation Cobra beginning on the 25th of July, it found its opposition significantly weakened. General George Patton's Third Army, unleashed through the gap created by Cobra, swept through Brittany and then drove east across France at a pace that recalled the opening campaigns of 1940. By the end of August 1944, Paris had been liberated. On the 25th of August, French forces were specifically allowed to lead the entry into the capital, a decision of enormous political symbolism, and Allied spearheads were approaching the Belgian border. The liberation of Western France had taken less than 3 months from the first landing. German forces in Normandy had suffered catastrophically. In the Falaise pocket in August, substantial portions of 2 German armies were encircled and destroyed, with tens of thousands killed and more than 50,000 taken prisoner. The Wehrmacht in the West would never recover the strength it had before the Normandy campaign. The question that now animated Allied planning was whether Germany could be knocked out of the war before the end of 1944, before the Soviet armies, advancing from the east, arrived at the same conclusion from the other direction. Chapter 14. The Stumbles Toward Victory, Market Garden, the Bulge and the Cost of Confidence. There is something in the history of the autumn of 1944 that I find genuinely instructive about the nature of military overconfidence, and I want to spend time on it because it's a period that gets compressed in popular history into a simple narrative. The Allies nearly made it, in one go, were stopped, then ground the Germans down through the winter. That compression misses the particular texture of the decisions made and the arguments had between September 1944 and the spring of 1945. Decisions that cost, cumulatively, an enormous number of lives and whose necessity is still disputed. By September 1944, Allied forces had liberated France, Belgium, and Luxembourg with extraordinary speed. The problem was logistics. The Allied armies had advanced so rapidly that their supply lines, still anchored on Normandy beaches and the Mulberry harbors, since the major port of Cherbourg had been comprehensively wrecked by retreating Germans, were stretched to breaking point. Patton's Third Army frequently ran out of fuel. Bradley's 12th Army Group was rationing artillery shells. The Red Ball Express, a continuous truck convoy system running around the clock to push supplies forward, was consuming fuel almost as fast as it was delivering it. The logistical reality of 1944 is one of those subjects where the archival material is dense and technical and absolutely essential for understanding why the war didn't end in the autumn. German forces, which had seemed on the verge of complete collapse in August, were given weeks in which to reconstitute a defensive line precisely because Allied armies couldn't maintain the offensive pace without fuel and ammunition they didn't have. Into this logistical context, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proposed Operation Market Garden, an airborne and ground assault designed to seize a series of bridges over the major river obstacles in the Netherlands, the Maas, the Waal, and the Rhine, and establish a bridgehead beyond the Rhine at Arnhem. The operation, if successful, would bypass the northern end of the German defensive Siegfried Line and open a route into the North German plain. Montgomery argued it could end the war by Christmas 1944. Eisenhower approved it, over the reservations of several senior American commanders, partly for political reasons. The British had been pressing for a full-blooded thrust into Germany for weeks, and some degree of accommodation was necessary to maintain coalition cohesion. The operation began on the 17th of September, 1944, with the largest airborne drop since the Normandy landings. The American 82nd and 100 and 1st Airborne Divisions secured their objectives at Nijmegen and Eindhoven. The British 1st Airborne Division dropped roughly 13 kilometers from its objective at Arnhem, ran into 2 SS Panzer divisions that Allied intelligence had identified, but that the operations planners had, fatally, not adequately planned around. The single road north, Hell's Highway, was repeatedly cut by German counterattacks. Ground forces trying to push north on schedule fell behind. The British paratroopers at Arnhem held the northern end of the bridge for 4 days against armored opposition, in fighting of extraordinary ferocity. It wasn't enough. Market Garden failed. Of the approximately 10,000 men of the 1st Airborne who were dropped at Arnhem, roughly 2,300 were evacuated back across the Rhine. The rest were killed or captured. Arnhem forced a recalibration. Eisenhower's broad front strategy, advancing on multiple axes simultaneously rather than committing everything to one thrust, was reimposed over Montgomery's objections. The priority became clearing the Scheldt estuary to open the port of Antwerp, the largest port in northwest Europe, which Allied forces had captured largely intact in early September, but couldn't use because the Germans still controlled the river approaches. This clearing operation, fought in terrible conditions in the flooded polders of the Dutch coastline through October and November, has been called the most important and most forgotten campaign on the Western Front in 1944. The Canadians who bore the brunt of it fought in knee-deep cold water through flooded farmland against prepared German positions for 6 weeks. When Antwerp finally opened in late November, the logistical crisis that had been building since September began to ease. It was unglamorous, grinding, costly work. Exactly the kind of campaign that doesn't feature prominently in popular histories, but without which the final advance into Germany couldn't have happened. Then, on the 16th of December, 1944, Germany launched its final major offensive on the Western Front, the Ardennes Offensive. The battle that Americans would call the Battle of the Bulge struck the American line in the exact same Ardennes forest through which Germany had launched its decisive attack in May 1940. The American line there was lightly held, partly because the terrain was considered too difficult for a major attack, an intelligence and doctrinal assumption that hadn't been updated despite the evidence of 1940. 3 German armies, under the overall command of Field Marshal Walter Model, struck along a roughly 140-kilometer front in poor weather that grounded Allied air power. In the opening days, German forces achieved genuine tactical surprise, pushing the American line back in several sectors and creating a bulge roughly 80 kilometers deep. Units were cut off, headquarters were overrun, and the scale of the confusion in the American rear areas in the first 48 hours was serious. 2 American infantry regiments in the northern shoulder were destroyed. The town of Bastogne, a critical road junction, was surrounded, and the American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division defending it, famously commanded in this period by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, were told by German commanders to surrender or face destruction. McAuliffe's documented reply was a single word: nuts! The bulge ultimately failed for 2 interconnected reasons. First, the German offensive's logistical plan required capturing Allied fuel depots in the opening days. German armored forces ran critically short of fuel before they could reach the Meuse, their minimum objective, and several armored columns were simply abandoned when they ran dry. Second, the weather cleared on the 23rd of December, allowing Allied air power, which had been completely neutralized during the offensive's opening phase, to strike the German supply lines and armored columns with devastating effect. Patton's Third Army executed one of the more remarkable feats of the war's Western campaign, turning 90 degrees north and attacking into the southern flank of the bulge within 72 hours of being ordered to do so, a reorientation of an entire army's axis of advance that most military planning would have suggested required weeks. By late January 1945, the bulge had been entirely eliminated. Germany had expended its last significant armored reserve in the West. The road to the Rhine was open. Chapter 15. The Pacific grinding, island hopping, firestorms, and the logic of the unthinkable. The Pacific War, by the middle of 1944, had evolved into a campaign strategy that the United States called island hopping, the selective seizure of key islands that could provide bases for advancing air power and naval operations, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions. where possible, and leaving them to wither without supply. The logic was sound strategically. The execution was, island by island, a form of combat that placed extraordinary demands on the men doing it, in conditions, heat, disease, jungle terrain, and a Japanese doctrine of resistance to the last man, that the European theater, brutal as it was, generally didn't replicate in the same form. The invasion of Saipan in the Mariana Islands in June 1944 was strategically decisive in ways that weren't immediately obvious to the public following the campaign. Saipan and the other Mariana Islands, seized alongside it, placed the American B-29 Superfortress bombers within range of the Japanese home islands for the first time. The distance from the Marianas to Tokyo is approximately 2,400 kilometers, within the operational radius of the B-29, which had been designed specifically with that range in mind. The fall of Saipan triggered a political crisis in Japan. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned, acknowledging that Japan's inner defensive perimeter had been breached in a way that could not be reversed. His successors faced the same strategic dilemma without the political authority to resolve it. Japan could not win the war, but the military establishment's commitment to a code that equated surrender with dishonor made negotiation almost impossibly difficult to contemplate, let alone initiate. The battles that followed the Marianas established a pattern of cost that American planners and political leadership were tracking with increasing urgency. The Battle for Peleliu, from September through November 1944, an operation whose strategic necessity some historians have questioned, cost the 1st Marine Division more than 6,000 casualties in fighting through a coral ridge system the Japanese had honeycombed with interconnected cave positions. Iwo Jima, from February through March 1945, was fought for an island roughly 21 square kilometers in area at an eventual cost of approximately 6,800 American dead and more than 19,000 wounded, against a Japanese garrison of approximately 21,000, of whom fewer than 220 survived as prisoners. Iwo Jima is the battle where the famous photograph of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi was taken, on the 23rd of February, 1945. The battle's name had become synonymous with the grinding cost of the Pacific Campaign even before it was over. And Okinawa, from April through June 1945, was larger still, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific theater, involving more than 500,000 American military personnel, at a cost of approximately 12,000 American dead, alongside the deaths of approximately 110,000 Japanese soldiers, and in a figure that still generates profound historical debate about how this campaign was conducted. Somewhere between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians. That civilian death range, its width alone, is a measure of how inadequately documented the human cost of the ground fighting on Okinawa remains. The air campaign against Japan had moved by the spring of 1945 into a phase that was qualitatively different from anything the Pacific had seen before. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the 20th Air Force, shifted strategy in March 1945 from high-altitude precision bombing, which had achieved limited results against Japanese industrial targets, partly because of weather and partly because Japanese industry was more dispersed than German industry, to low-altitude night firebombing of Japanese cities. On the night of the 9th to the 10th of March 1945, more than 300 B-29s dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo. The resulting firestorm destroyed roughly 41 square kilometers of the city and killed an estimated 80 to 100,000 people in a single night, more than were killed immediately by either atomic bomb. I want to be honest that I find this campaign deeply uncomfortable to write about, in a way that is different from the discomfort of writing about conventional battles. The strategic logic, as LeMay and his planners articulated it, was that destroying Japanese industrial capacity and demonstrating the cost of continued resistance was the fastest way to end the war and thus reduce total casualties on both sides. The moral weight of that argument, set against the reality of what the firebombing campaigns produced, is something I can present, but not resolve for you. By the summer of 1945, Japan's situation was militarily hopeless in any objective assessment. The Navy had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. The Air Force had been reduced to kamikaze operations, suicide attacks, which were tactically costly to the Americans and reflected a strategic desperation rather than a genuine capacity to reverse the tide of the war. Japan was blockaded. Food and fuel were critically scarce, and yet the debate within Japanese leadership about surrender was paralyzed. The peace faction existed and was active, but the military hardliners commanded sufficient influence to block formal overtures. American planners, looking at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and extrapolating to an invasion of Kyushu, planned as Operation Downfall, were projecting Allied casualties in the hundreds of thousands and Japanese military and civilian casualties potentially in the millions. Those projections shaped, in ways that are now well documented, the decision made in Washington about an alternative. The Manhattan Project, the American program to develop an atomic weapon, had begun in earnest in 1942, drawing on scientific refugee talent from Europe and the industrial capacity of the United States at sites in Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Hanford in Washington State, and Los Alamos in New Mexico. On the 16th of July, 1945, the first atomic device was successfully tested at the Trinity site in New Mexico. President Harry Truman. Roosevelt had died in April, and Truman had been in office only 3 months when the test succeeded, was informed of the result at Potsdam, where he was meeting with Stalin and Churchill's successor Clement Attlee. The Potsdam Declaration, issued on the 26th of July, called on Japan to surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. Japan's government made no immediate formal response. On the 6th of August, 1945, a single B-29 named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb code-named Little Boy on the city of Hiroshima. Approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people died immediately or within hours. By the end of 1945, the death toll from the bomb's effects, burns, blast injuries, radiation sickness, had reached approximately 90,000 to 140,000. On the 9th of August, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, killing approximately 40,000 to 80,000 people. On the same day, the Soviet Union, honoring its commitment made at Yalta, declared war on Japan and invaded Japanese-held Manchuria. On the 15th of August, 1945, Emperor Hirohito broadcast his announcement of surrender to the Japanese people, the first time most Japanese subjects had ever heard his voice. The formal surrender was signed on the 2nd of September, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Chapter 16. Germany's Final Hours. From the Rhine to the bunker. The Allied crossing of the Rhine in the spring of 1945 was not, as the liberation of Paris had been, a moment of uncomplicated triumph. The fighting that preceded it, through the Hurtgen Forest, from September 1944 through February 1945, a battle that is one of the least celebrated and most costly American engagements of the Western Front, fought through dense forest in winter conditions against prepared German defenses, had been grinding, expensive, and demoralizing. The Hurtgen cost American forces approximately 33,000 casualties for a patch of forest that had limited strategic value, and it demonstrated that even a Germany clearly losing the war remained capable of inflicting enormous damage on forces that approached it without sufficient preparation. I mention it precisely because it doesn't appear in most popular accounts. The battles that don't have famous names or clear turning points tend to disappear from the narrative. But the men who fought in them didn't disappear, and neither did their families. The crossing of the Rhine came partly through planning and partly through fortune. On the 7th of March, 1945, troops of the American 9th Armored Division discovered that the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was still intact. German engineers had attempted to destroy it, but the demolition had partially failed. American forces crossed immediately and established a bridgehead on the east bank of the Rhine. The news reached Eisenhower, who later wrote that it was among the best he had received in the entire war. Additional crossings were planned and executed over the following weeks, including Montgomery's massive set-piece operation, Operation Plunder, on the 23rd of March, involving more than 1,000,000 men, a massive artillery bombardment, and another large-scale airborne operation, which Montgomery had prepared with his characteristic thoroughness and which attracted characteristic American complaints about its slowness and resource consumption. By April, American forces were encircling the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, in an operation that resulted in the surrender of approximately 325,000 German troops, the largest single encirclement on the Western Front. From the east, Soviet forces had been advancing since the Vistula-Oder offensive of January 1945, which had driven German forces back from Poland and closed to within roughly 80 kilometers of Berlin by early February. The cost of the Soviet advance had been enormous. Soviet casualties in the first quarter of 1945 were staggering, but the momentum was irreversible. The race to Berlin, in the sense of whether American or Soviet forces would arrive first, was essentially settled by the broad strategic decisions that had been made at Yalta in February. The zones of occupation had been agreed, and Berlin would fall within the designated Soviet zone. Eisenhower, to the frustration of some of his British colleagues and to the outrage of Patton, decided against racing to Berlin, judging that taking casualties to capture a city that would then have to be handed to the Soviets was strategically unjustifiable. There is a legitimate counter-argument that an American presence in Berlin would have altered the post-war political negotiations significantly. But Eisenhower's decision was defensible within the military logic he was applying. The Battle of Berlin, fought from the 16th of April to the 2nd of May 1945, was the final major engagement of the European War, and it was catastrophically costly, primarily for the Soviet forces conducting it and for the city's civilian population. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front attacked with overwhelming force across the Oder and Neisse rivers and converged on the German capital. German defenses, manned by a combination of exhausted regular troops, Waffen-SS units, Hitler Youth Boys, and elderly Home Guard fighters, were impossible to sustain against a Soviet force that eventually numbered approximately 2.5 million men with roughly 6,000 tanks. Soviet losses in the battle were approximately 80,000 killed, an enormous figure for a single urban battle that lasted barely 2 weeks. German military and civilian deaths were also catastrophic in scale. Though precise figures remain disputed, the city was reduced to rubble. Adolf Hitler remained in his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin as the Soviet encirclement closed. The final weeks of his presence there, documented through the testimonies of those who were with him and who survived, are a picture of deepening unreality, ordering non-existent armies counterattack, dismissing his most senior military advisors, distributing blame with increasing venom. On the 29th of April, he married Eva Braun, who had come to Berlin to be with him. On the 30th of April, 1945, with Soviet forces fighting within a few hundred meters of the bunker, Hitler died by suicide. His body and Eva Braun's were burned in the Reich Chancellery garden in accordance with his instructions. The Third Reich, which its architect had declared would last 1,000 years, had lasted 12. On the 7th of May, 1945, at Rams, Germany signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. Fighting ceased at 1 minute past midnight on the 9th of May, 1945. In Moscow, it was already the 9th of May when the ceasefire took effect, which is why Russia commemorates Victory Day on the 9th, while the West observes VE Day on the 8th. It's a small difference in dates that carries, if you think about it, a significant weight of perspective. What I find myself thinking about whenever I work through the final months of the European war is the particular cruelty of dying in the war's last weeks. The men killed at the Hurtgen Forest, the Remagen bridgehead, in the final Soviet push across the Oder. They died after the outcome was certain, in a war whose conclusion was no longer in doubt but whose machinery had not yet wound down. The distance between "the war is decided" and "the war is over" was measured in human lives in the tens of thousands, and those lives are not a footnote. They are the full weight of what it means for organized violence, once set in motion, to come to rest. Chapter 17. What the War Left Behind, the World It Made. In the late spring of 1945, a series of photographs began circulating in American and British newspapers that showed what Allied soldiers had found when they entered the German concentration camp system. The images from Bergen-Belsen, liberated by British forces on the 15th of April, from Dachau, liberated by American forces on the 29th of April, from Buchenwald and Mauthausen, and the photographs taken by Soviet forces at Auschwitz-Birkenau, liberated in January. These were not the first evidence the Allied governments had received of what the camp system was. Official knowledge of the Exterminationsprozesse had existed in Allied capitals since at least 1942, conveyed through Polish government-in-exile reports and the testimony of escapees. But the photographs were the first time mass populations in the West confronted the reality directly. The response, the attempt to process and institutionalize what that confrontation meant, shaped the post-war world in ways whose consequences we are still living with. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945 and ran through October 1946, were the first major international criminal tribunal in history. 24 major Nazi leaders were indicted on charges that included crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The last category being a legal concept largely codified for the first time through the Nuremberg process itself. 12 were sentenced to death. The legal framework established at Nuremberg was genuinely novel and genuinely contested. The defense argued, with some force, that the concept of individual criminal responsibility for acts of state was being invented retroactively and applied to the defeated rather than to all parties. The counter-argument, articulated most effectively by the chief American prosecutor Robert Jackson, was that the alternative, treating mass murder as a purely political matter, subject to no legal accountability, was simply not acceptable as a foundation for the post-war order. Both arguments were serious. The trials proceeded. The precedent was set. International criminal law traces a direct line from Nuremberg to every subsequent tribunal. The physical condition of Europe in 1945 defies easy description. Large portions of Germany's cities had been reduced to rubble. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, Frankfurt, Berlin. Warsaw had been deliberately and almost comprehensively destroyed by German forces following the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. Leningrad had survived a siege of 872 days at the cost of more than 1 million civilian deaths from starvation and bombardment. The industrial infrastructure of large parts of the continent, bridges, railways, factories, power stations, had been systematically destroyed, partly by retreating forces, partly by bombing campaigns. Agricultural production across Europe had collapsed. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration estimated in 1945 and 46 that large portions of the European population were surviving on caloric intakes below subsistence level. The humanitarian crisis of 1945 was immense, and it was addressed, imperfectly and incompletely, by a combination of American aid, international organization, and the sheer, exhausted determination of European populations to rebuild. The political architecture of the post-war world was assembled partly through wartime agreements and partly through the rapid hardening of positions that the end of the common enemy permitted. The United Nations Organization, formally established in October 1945, was a more institutionally serious attempt at international organization than the League of Nations had been, with a Security Council structure that acknowledged explicitly that the great powers had to be inside and invested rather than outside and contemptuous. The Bretton Woods agreements of July 1944 had already established the institutional framework for the post-war global economy, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and a system of fixed exchange rates anchored to the American dollar, which was itself anchored to gold. These agreements reflected the scale of American economic dominance at the war's end in a way that the political agreements tried to soften but couldn't entirely conceal. The United States, which had entered the war as the world's largest economy, emerged from it with its industrial plant intact, its territory unoccupied, and its military and financial power without precedent in modern history. The Soviet Union emerged from the war in a condition that contained extraordinary contradictions. It had suffered losses that no other major power approached, somewhere between 25 and 27 million dead, an economy that had been partially destroyed and then partially reconstituted through the evacuation and reconstruction of industry east of the Urals, a population traumatized at a level that would shape Soviet society for decades. And simultaneously, it had emerged as a military superpower, with the largest land army in the world, occupying a belt of territory from Berlin to the Pacific, and with a political prestige derived from its central role in defeating Germany that translated into significant communist political movements across post-war Western Europe. Stalin's Soviet Union was both genuinely weakened by the war and genuinely strengthened by it, which is one of the things that makes the Cold War, which began almost immediately, so structurally complex. The wartime alliance dissolved with a speed that surprised no one who had paid careful attention to the ideological hostility that had always underlain it. The colonial world's relationship to the Second World War is a dimension that I think gets consistently underweighted in European and American accounts of the conflict. More than 2.5 million Indian soldiers served in the British forces during the war, the largest volunteer army in history. Soldiers from across Africa, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific contributed in enormous numbers to the Allied war effort. The war also radically changed the colonial calculus. Britain emerged from the war exhausted, economically exhausted, and politically committed through its Atlantic Charter obligations to principles of self-determination that were difficult to reconcile with the continued existence of an empire. India achieved independence in August 1947. Over the following decade, independence movements across Asia and Africa accelerated, drawing on both the moral language of the anti-fascist war and the practical reality that European colonial powers simply no longer had the military and economic resources to maintain their empires by force. The world that emerged from 1945 was not simply the world of 1939 with the bad actors removed. The war had dissolved the imperial order that had organized most of the planet's territory since the 19th century. The displaced persons crisis of 1945 and 46 was one of the largest mass movements of human beings in modern history. Approximately 11 million displaced persons were in Germany and Austria at the war's end. Former forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, prisoners of war, refugees from the Eastern territories. Soviet citizens among them were repatriated, sometimes forcibly, under agreements made at Yalta. And the fate of many of those repatriated to the Soviet Union was, in numerous documented cases, imprisonment in the Gulag on suspicion of having collaborated with the enemy during their captivity. Jewish survivors in Europe, numbering perhaps 300,000, faced the specific problem that the communities they had come from had been destroyed, and their homes occupied by other families. The vast majority of surviving European Jews eventually emigrated to the new state of Israel, established in May 1948, or to the United States, or to other destinations. The expulsions of ethnic Germans from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania, approximately 12 to 14 million people, forced westward in the years immediately after the war, were among the largest forced population movements in European history. endorsed by the Allied powers at the Potsdam Conference as a means of making the new borders of Eastern Europe ethnically coherent. The suffering involved was enormous. It was largely invisible to Western public opinion, which was focused elsewhere. The atomic bomb was the weapon that ended the Pacific War, and it was also the weapon that defined the character of the peace. Two cities had been destroyed by single bombs. The Soviet Union detonated its own atomic device in August 1949. The logic of deterrence: that nuclear weapons were too destructive to use, and that their primary function was therefore to prevent their own use, settled over international relations with a weight that had no real precedent. The Cold War, with all of its proxy conflicts and arms races and ideological contests, was structured around the central fact that the two dominant powers could, if they chose to fight each other, directly destroy not just each other, but human civilization. Whether the atomic bomb shortened the Second World War, or whether it introduced into the world a permanent existential risk that outweighs any benefit it conferred, is a debate that's serious. Historians, ethicists, and strategists have been having for 80 years and have not resolved. I don't think it is resolvable. I think it is one of those questions that history hands to each generation and demands they sit with honestly. What is the Second World War, then? After everything I've read, after all the operational maps and diplomatic cables, and after action reports and survivors' testimonies, I think it was many different wars simultaneously: a war of ideology, a war of empire, a war of industrial production, a war of racial extermination, a war of national survival, whose unity was imposed partly by the formal declarations of its participants and partly, retrospectively, by the need for a comprehensible narrative. What connects Stalingrad to the Normandy beaches, to Iwo Jima, to the killing fields of Auschwitz isn't a single theme. It is a period of human time, roughly 6 years, in which the capacity for organized violence reached scales that no previous civilization had achieved, and in which that capacity was deployed by states against both military and civilian population, in ways that permanently changed how humanity thought about war, about sovereignty, about human rights, and about the kind of peace that is worth building and the kind that simply produces the next catastrophe. The Second World War didn't end history. It didn't end conflict. What it did was establish, at almost incomprehensible cost, a set of institutions, norms, and memories that have shaped every significant international event since. Imperfectly, incompletely, but durably. That durability is not nothing. It was paid for at a price that should never feel distant.